I'm the executive director here at the Sanctuary for Independent Media in Troy, New York. And we're going to get started in just a moment with Chris Hedges and his new talk, American Sadism. Before we do that, though, I wanted to let you know that Chris has been here a number of times. I think this might be his 6th time here in Troy, or at least at the Sanctuary for Independent Media over the last many years. We've been around here for about 16 years and operate a media center with a real community orientation that's developed over the years into a pretty widespread campus in north central Troy that includes indoor and outdoor performance venues, gardens. We just opened our environmental justice center just down the block this weekend. And we continue to do a wide variety of programming that focuses on the intersection of art, science, and justice, trying to figure out what we can do to change the narrative around us in the city, in the country, and around the world as best we can. So if you tuned in early, you heard some of the sustainers who sustain us here at the Sanctuary. It's a tough thing to keep this going. It's been a tough year, but with the support of individuals like many of you, we've been able to make it and hope to thrive coming out of this. It's been very clear to us, something that those of us who are older have known for a long time, that the only way to true independence is widespread support. Lots of people making small donations to help things keep moving here. Grants don't do it, corporate donations obviously don't do it. It's not about big money support, it's about widespread support to keep us honest and to keep us independent. And that's what Sanctuary Sustainers do. So if you get a minute, go to our website, mediasanctuary.org, and sign up to be a sustainer. Make a regular contribution of any amount and help us keep going. We're really thrilled to have Chris Hedges back here at the Sanctuary for Independent Media. His talks on YouTube have millions of views, not just ours, but many of the talks he does throughout the year. But his talks are amongst the most viewed that we have. And it really is a testimony to the power of his words and the hunger for people to hear an alternative narrative about what's happening in this country, what's happening to us. He's an activist, he's a journalist, a writer, teaches in the prisons, a real Renaissance man. And it's great to have him back here again on this hot June evening. Without further ado, I'd like to bring Chris Hedges back to the stage.
Thanks, Steve. I'm a huge supporter of Sanctuary. I think that it's the model for resistance. Resistance always comes from the ground up, and it always requires community, and it requires a multiplicity of fronts, whether that's food or media or education, all of which Sanctuary does. So I always am thrilled to come here, come to Troy. I admire very much what Sanctuary does. So this talk is called American Sadism. Sadism defines nearly every cultural, social, and political experience in the United States. It is expressed in the unchecked greed of an oligarchic elite that has seen its wealth increase during the pandemic by $1.1 trillion, while the country has suffered the sharpest rise in its poverty rate in more than 50 years. It is expressed in the wanton killings by police of unarmed citizens in cities such as Minneapolis. It is expressed in the enhanced interrogation techniques used by the CIA at secret black sites, Guantanamo Bay, and in our prisons at home. It is expressed in the separation of children from their parents, where they are held as if they were dogs in a kennel. It is expressed in the pornification of American society, where women are tortured, beaten, degraded, and sexually violated, often by numerous men in porn films, and then discarded after a few weeks or months with severe trauma. along with sexually transmitted diseases and vaginal and anal tears that must be repaired surgically. It is expressed in the incel movement that perpetuates violent assaults against women by men who say they have been spurned or ignored by women. It is expressed in the predatory healthcare system where, as Steve Brill writes, a trip to the emergency room for chest pains that turn out to be indigestion can exceed the cost of a semester at college. Simple lab work done during a few days in a hospital can be more expensive than a new car. And a drug that requires $300 to make, and that the manufacturer sells to a hospital for between $3,000 and $3,500 can cost the patient to whom it is prescribed $13,702. It is legally permissible in the United States for corporations to hold sick children hostage while their parents bankrupt themselves to save their sons or daughters. This sadism is expressed in payday loans, for-profit prisons, the privatization of public education and public utilities, and the rise of for-profit mercenary armies. It is expressed in the cultural glorification of violence by mass media, the state, and the entertainment and gaming industries. It is expressed in the nihilistic mass shootings at schools, including elementary schools and workplaces. And it is expressed in the murderous and futile wars we prosecute or support in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. The historian Johann Huizinga, writing about the twilight of the Middle Ages, argued that as things fall apart, sadism is embraced to cope with the hostility of an indifferent universe. No longer bound by a common purpose, a ruptured society retreats into hedonism and the cult of the self. It celebrates, as corporations on Wall Street or popular reality television shows celebrate, the classic traits of psychopaths: superficial charm, grandiosity, and self-importance, a need for constant stimulation, a penchant for lying, deception, and manipulation, and the incapacity for remorse or guilt. Get what you can as fast as you can before someone else gets it. This is the state of nature, the war of all against all Thomas Hobbes saw as the consequence of social disintegration, a world in which life becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is a world in which powerful men like Jeffrey Epstein or Harvey Weinstein reduce the bodies and selfhoods of their victims to nothing. We know what this sadism looks like. It looks like Derek Chauvin nonchalantly choking to death George Floyd as his police colleagues watch impassively. It looks like Andrew Brown Jr., shot 5 times by police in North Carolina, including once in the back of the head. It looks like Abner Louima, who had a broomstick pushed up his rectum by police in a bathroom at the 70th Precinct Station House in Brooklyn, requiring 3 major operations to repair the internal injuries. It looks like the Navy SEAL Special Operations Chief Edward Gallagher, randomly shooting to death unarmed civilians and using a hunting knife to repeatedly stab an injured, sedated, 17-year-old Iraqi prisoner, and then photographing himself with a corpse. It looks like Iraqi civilians, few of whom had anything to do with the insurgency, naked, bound, beaten, and sexually humiliated and raped and at times murdered by army guards and private contractors in Abu Ghraib. It looks like the prisoners in Abu Ghraib who were routinely dragged across the prison floor by a rope tied to their penises and were sodomized by chemical lights, or had chemical lights snapped open so the phosphorus liquid could be poured over their naked bodies. The leaked pictures from Abu Ghraib are the true face of America. The hooded man, a dark, caped figure standing on a box, arms outstretched, wires attached to his fingers. Or the naked, leashed man lying at the feet of the female American soldier in camouflage pants who holds his leash, one end wrapped around his neck in her hand. Why is the malaise of a dying civilization expressed through sadism rather than a kind of righteous anger? And here we must turn to Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche warned that those who are humiliated and disempowered are poisoned by ressentiment. Because they have been stripped of agency, they lack the power to harm those who they believe harm them. In short, there is no cathartic release. Ressentiment is bred from damaged self-esteem. It festers and corrodes the soul. The powerless, and here Nietzsche is writing about Christianity as a slave religion, must express their ressentiment obliquely and surreptitiously. Hence the coded racism, Islamophobia, and supposed yearning for a return to the traditional family and quote-unquote Christian values. Ressentiment is produced by feelings of inferiority, failure, and worthlessness. And this ressentiment, fueled by self-loathing, expresses itself through sadism, what Nietzsche calls wrecking the will of those who are weaker or more vulnerable. Nietzsche understood that this wrecking the will of others imparts a perverted, sadistic pleasure. He writes in On the Genealogy of Morals that to see others suffer does one good, to make others suffer even more. Without cruelty there is no festival, and in punishment there is so much that is festive. The ressentiment in American society, the political scientist Wendy Brown writes, is born not only from feelings of powerlessness and worthlessness, but feelings of dethronement and lost entitlement. It explains what she calls the permanent politics of revenge, of attacking those blamed for dethronement, white maleness, those blamed for the dethronement of white maleness, feminists, multiculturalists, globalists, who both unseat and disdain them. For this reason, the rage cannot, as it could be in Christian theology, sublimated into self-abnegation and a call to love thy neighbor. There is, in short, nothing to mitigate or redirect this ressentiment. Its pure expression is nihilism and sadism. Trump embodied this dark ethic. Revenge is his sole philosophy of life. Those gripped by ressentiment are no longer able to create. They can only destroy. They gleefully ignite their own funeral pyre. Laws, institution, and bureaucratic structures are deformed to serve the interests of a tiny cabal, a rapacious elite, which enriches itself at the expense of everyone else. All are made to bow before the dictates of what Max Weber called the inanimate machine. The inanimate machine forces the vast majority into the mass, but it allows a selected few, willing to do its dirty work, to rise above the multitude. These privileged few are given the license and authority to carry out the acts of sadism that have become the primary forms of social control. These enforcers do this work vigorously, For their greatest fear is being pushed back into the mass. The more these foot soldiers for the elite insult, persecute, torture, humiliate, and kill, the more they seem to magically widen the divide between themselves and their victims. And this is why black police and corrections officers can be as cruel and sometimes crueler than their white counterparts. The sadism eradicates, at least momentarily, the sadist's feelings of worthlessness, vulnerability, and susceptibility to pain and death. It imparts feelings of omnipotence. It is pleasurable. I was beaten by Saudi military police and later by Saddam Hussein's secret police when I was taken prisoner in Basra shortly after the First Gulf War. Those who beat me enjoyed their work. I could see it on their faces. Israel's abuse of the Palestinians, the assaults of Muslims on Muslims and girls in India, and the denigration of Muslims in countries we occupy are part of the scourge of sadism in service to an inanimate machine that has become global. Feminists have long understood that sadism runs like an electric current through male sexual desire. Pornography is about the fantasy of men who are omnipotent, who have the power to torture and physically abuse girls and women, who in porn beg to be degraded. Sexual fun and sexual passion in the privacy of the male imagination are inseparable from the brutality of male history, Andrea Dworkin writes. The private world of sexual dominance that men demand as their right and their freedom is the mirror image of the public world of sadism and atrocity that men consistently and self-righteously deplore. It is in the male experience of pleasure that one finds the meaning of male history. Women, of course, are not immune from acts of sadism. Ilse Koch, known as the bitch of Buchenwald with her husband, the commandant of the death camp, used to throw prisoners into bears' cages to watch them get ripped apart and devoured. The Chilean, Adriana Rivas, facing extradition to Chile from Australia, reportedly tortured prisoners by strapping them to metal bunk beds rigged with electric current and sending shocks throughout their bodies, or suffocated them to death with plastic bags during the regime of Augusto Pinochet. But Dworkin is right to highlight sadism as inherent in male expressions of total and unaccountable power. And this is why sadism is the chief characteristic of imperialism. Jean Armory, who was in the Belgian resistance in World War II and who was captured and tortured by the Gestapo in 1943, defines sadism as the radical negation of the other, the simultaneous denial of both the social principle and the reality principle. In a sadist world, torture, destruction, and death are triumphant. And such a world clearly has no hope of survival. On the contrary, he desires to transcend the world, to achieve total sovereignty by negating fellow human beings, which he sees as representing a peculiar kind of hell. Armory's point is important. A sadistic society is about collective self-destruction. It is the apotheosis of a society deformed by overwhelming experiences of loss, alienation, and stasis. The only way left to affirm yourself in a failed society is to destroy. Johann Huizinga, in his book, Waning of the Middle Ages, noted that the dissolution of medieval society provoked what he called the violent tenor of life. Today, this violent tenor of life drives people to carry out wanton police murders, evict families, court-ordered bankruptcies, the denial of Medicare to the sick, suicide bombings, and mass shootings. Sadism imparts the rush and pleasure, often with heavy sexual overtones, which lures us towards what Sigmund Freud called the death instinct. The instinct to destroy all forms of life, including our own. When enveloped by a death-saturated world, death, ironically, is embraced as the cure. Joseph Conrad saw enough of the world as a sea captain to know the irredeemable corruption of humanity, the noble virtues that drove characters like Kurtz in Heart of Darkness into the jungle veiled, the abject self-interest, unchecked greed and murder that defines all imperial projects. Conrad was in the Congo in the late 19th century when the Belgian monarch King Leopold, in the name of Western civilization and anti-slavery, was plundering the country. The Belgian occupation, which turned the Congo into a rubber plantation, resulted in the death by disease, starvation, and murder of some 10 million Congolese. In Conrad's short story, An Outpost of Progress, he writes of two white European traders, Collier and Kayerts, who are sent to a remote trading station in the Congo. The mission is endowed with a great moral purpose to export European civilization to Africa. But the boredom and lack of constraints swiftly turn the two men into savages. They trade slaves for ivory. They get into a feud over dwindling food supplies, and Kayerts shoots and kills his unarmed companion. They were two perfectly insignificant and incapable individuals, Conrad wrote, whose existence is only rendered possible through the high organization of civilized crowds. Few men realize that their life, the very essence of their character, their capabilities and their audacities, are only the expression of their belief in the safety of their surroundings. The courage, the composure, the confidence, the emotions and principles, every great and every insignificant thought belongs not to the individual, but to the crowd. To the crowd that believes blindly in the irresistible force of its institutions and its morals, in the power of its police and of its opinion. But the contact with pure, unmitigated savagery, with primitive nature and primitive man, brings sudden and profound trouble to the heart, to this sentiment of being alone of one's kind, to the clear perception of the loneliness of one's thought, of one's sensations, to the negation of the habitual, which is safe. There is added the affirmation of the unusual, which is dangerous. A suggestion of things vague, uncontrollable, and repulsive, whose discomposing intrusion excites the imagination and tries the civilized nerves of the foolish and the wise alike. The managing director of the great civilizing company, for as Conrad notes, civilization follows trade, arrives by steamer at the end of the story. He is not met at the dock by his two agents. He climbs the steep bank to the trading station with the captain and engine driver behind him. The director finds Kayerts, who after the murder committed suicide by hanging himself by a leather strap from a cross that marked the grave of the previous station chief. His toes are a couple inches above the ground, his arms hang stiffly down, and inadvertently, he was putting out a swollen tongue at the managing director. Sadism is carried out in the name of a moral good, to protect Western civilization, quote-unquote Christian values, democracy, the master race, liberté, égalité, fraternité, the worker's paradise, the new man, or scientific rationalism. Sadism will mend the flaws in the human species. The jargon varies, but the dark sentiment is the same. Honor, justice, compassion, and freedom are ideas that have no converts, Conrad writes. They are only people. without knowing, understanding, or feeling, who intoxicate themselves with words, shout them out, imagining they believe them without believing in anything else but profit, personal advantage, and their own satisfaction. For man is a cruel animal, he went on. His cruelty must be organized. Society is essentially criminal, or it wouldn't exist. It is selfishness that saves everything, absolutely everything. Everything that we abhor, everything that we love. Bertrand Russell said of Conrad, "I felt, though I do not know whether he would have accepted such an image, that he thought of civilized and morally tolerable life as a dangerous walk on a thin crust of barely cooled lava, which at any moment might break and let the unwary sink into fiery depths." Kurtz, the self-deluded, megalomaniac ivory trader in Heart of Darkness, ends by planting the shriveled heads of murdered Congolese on pikes outside his remote trading station. But Kurtz is also highly educated and refined. Conrad describes him as an orator, writer, poet, musician, and the respected chief agent of the Ivory Company's inner station. He is an emissary of pity and science and progress. Kurtz was a universal genius and a very remarkable person. He is a prodigy, at once gifted and multi-talented. He went to Africa fired by noble ideals and virtues. He ended his life as a self-deluded tyrant who thought he was a god. His mother was half English, his father was half French. Conrad writes of Kurtz, "All Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz." And by the by, I learned that most appropriately the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs had entrusted him with the making of a report for its future guidance. He began with the argument that we whites, from the point of development we had arrived at, must necessarily appear to them, the savages, in the nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with the might as of a deity, and so on and so on. By the simple exercise of our will, we can exert a power for good practically unbounded, etc., etc. From that point, he soared and took me with him. The peroration was magnificent, though difficult to remember, you know. It gave me the notion of an exotic immensity ruled by an august benevolence. It made me tingle with enthusiasm. This was the unbounded power of eloquence, of words, of burning, noble words. There were no practical hints to interrupt the magic current of phrases, unless a kind note at the foot of the last page, scrawled evidently much later in an unsteady hand, may be regarded as the exposition of a method. It was very simple, and at the end of the moving appeal to every altruistic sentiment, it blazed at you, luminous and terrifying, like a flash of lightning in a serene sky. Exterminate all the brutes. The violence and exploitation which has long defined imperial projects now defines existence at home. For empires, in the end, cannibalize themselves. The tyranny we long imposed on others, we now impose on ourselves. The dark pleasure derived from exploiting others is all that is left. As Nietzsche wrote in On the Genealogy of Morals, let's clarify the logic of this whole method of compensation. It is weird enough. The equivalency is given in this way. Instead of an advantage, making up directly for the harm, hence, instead of compensation in gold, land, possessions, or some sort of another, the creditor is given a kind of pleasure as repayment and compensation, the pleasure of being allowed to discharge his power on a powerless person without having to think about it. The delight in de faire le mal pour le plaisir de la mal, doing wrong for the pleasure of doing it. The enjoyment of violation. This enjoyment is more highly prized the lower and baser the debtor stands in the social order, and it can easily seem to the creditor a delicious mouthful, even a foretaste of higher rank. By means of the punishment of the debtor, the creditor participates in a right belonging to the masters. Finally, he himself for once comes to the lofty feeling of despising a being as someone below himself, as someone he is entitled to mistreat, or at least, in the event that the real force of punishment, of inflicting punishment, has already been transferred to the authorities, the feeling of seeing the debtor despised and mistreated. The compensation thus consists of a permission for and right to cruelty. Social sadism and murder, as Frederick Engels noted in his 1945 book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England, is built into the capitalist system. The ruling elites, Engels writes, those who hold social and political control were well aware that the harsh working and living conditions during the Industrial Revolution doomed workers to an early and unnatural death. The formation of unions and socialism were in direct response to these malevolent forces. As Engels wrote, when one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another, such that death results, we call his deed murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early death and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessities of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them through the strong arm of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain. Its deed is murder just as surely as the deed of the single individual. Disguised, malicious murder. Murder against which none can defend himself, which does not seem what it is, because no man sees the murderer, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more one of omission than of commission, but murder it remains. The ruling class devotes tremendous resources to mask this social sadism and murder. It controls the narrative in the press. It floods our screens with friendly, feel-good images and propaganda perfected by the public relations and advertising industries. These electronic hallucinations distract us from the limitations of our own lives. They obfuscate the fundamental nature of corporate capitalism. They attack our self-esteem and create an embarrassing self-consciousness about our appearance, social standing, and bodily functions. They falsify science and data, as the fossil fuel, animal agriculture, and tobacco industries have for decades. They create, as Guy Debord writes, the spectacular commodity society that is a seductive substitute to participatory democracy. This entrepreneurial tyranny reduces political choice to the sadistic prescriptions provided by corporate power. It creates a society where there is an absence of nearly all positive social and political constructs. Even social change, reduced to identity politics and multiculturalism, has been effectively emasculated by corporate propaganda. A sense of agency, personal power, and social status comes almost exclusively from, as Nietzsche foresaw, serving the sadistic machinery. Enron energy traders, in a dialogue that could have come from any large corporation, were caught on tape in 2000 discussing stealing from California, sticking it to Grandma Millie. Two traders identified as Kevin and Bob dismissed demands by California regulators for refunds because of the company's constant price gouging. So the rumor's true, Kevin says. They're effing taking all the money back from you guys. All this money you guys stole from those poor grandmothers in California. Yeah, Bob says. Grandma Millie, man. But she's the one who couldn't figure out how to effing vote on the butterfly ballot. Kevin. Yeah, now she wants her effing money back for all the power you've charged for effing $250 a megawatt hour. Bob. You know, Grandma Millie, she's the one that Al Gore's fighting for, you know. Later in the conversation, Kevin and Bob denigrate Californians. Kevin, Oh, the best thing that could happen is an effing earthquake. Let that thing float out to the Pacific and put 'em effing candles. Bob, I know. Those guys, just cut 'em off. Kevin, they're so effed, and they're so totally, Bob, yeah, they're so effed. The obscene avarice of the very rich now dwarfs the hedonism and excesses of the world's most heinous despots and wealthiest capitalists of the past. In 2015, shortly before he died, Forbes estimated David Rockefeller's net worth at $3 billion. The Shah of Iran looted an estimated $1 billion from the country. Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos amassed between $5 and $10 billion. And the former Zimbabwean president, Robert Mugabe was worth about $1 billion. But Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are each worth $180 billion. Yes, the decorum of the Biden presidency differs from that of the Trump presidency, but the underlying mercenary exploitation and sadism of American society remains untouched. Biden's American jobs plan will never create millions of good-paying jobs Americans can raise their families on, any more than NAFTA, which he supported, would, as was also promised, create millions of good-paying jobs. His mantra of Buy American is worthless. The vast majority of our consumer electronics, apparel, furniture, and industrial supplies are made in China by workers who earn an average of $1 or $2 an hour and lack unions and basic labor rights. His call to lower deductibles and prescription drug costs in the Affordable Care Act will never be permitted by the corporations that profit from the health care system. His promises of fair taxation, despite the world's richest men, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, Carl Icahn, Michael Bloomberg, and George Soros paying a true tax rate of 3.4%, will not be altered. The corporate subsidies and tax incentives he proposes as a solution to the climate crisis will do nothing to halt oil and gas fracking, shut down coal-fired plants, or halt the construction of new pipelines for gas-fired power plants. His money for infrastructure projects is destined for large corporations and state governments. The health system will remain privatized, meaning the insurance and pharmaceutical corporations will reap a windfall of tens of billions of dollars with the American Rescue Plan, and this when they are already making record profits. The profits the big banks, Wall Street, and the predatory global speculators make from the massive levels of debt peonage imposed on an underpaid working class, including those who owe student loans, will continue to funnel money upwards into the hands of a tiny oligarchic cabal. There will be no campaign finance reform to end our system of legalized bribery. The giant tech monopolies will remain intact. The censorship imposed by digital media platforms, the obliteration of our civil liberties, and the wholesale government surveillance will continue to be enforced. Biden's request for $715 billion for the Defense Department in fiscal year 2020, an $11.3 billion increase over 2021, will exacerbate the military provocations with China and Russia, the endless wars in the Middle East, and the bloated defense industry. The industries that were shipped overseas and the well-paying unionized jobs will not return. The 81 million Americans that struggle to meet basic household expenses, the 22 million that lack enough food, and the 11 million that can't make their next house payment are about to hit a wall as the meager benefits from the COVID relief bill runs out and the moratorium is lifted on evictions and foreclosures. The grinding machinery of predatory capitalism and the sadism that defines it will poison the society as mercilessly under Biden as it did when Trump was conducting his Twitter presidency. These so-called reforms have no more weight than those peddled by Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, who Biden slavishly served and who also promised social equality while betraying working men and women. Biden is the epitome of the empty, amoral creature produced by our system of legalized bribery, those who built our culture of sadism. His long political career in Congress was defined by representing the interests of big business, especially the credit card companies based in Delaware. He was nicknamed Senator Credit Card. He has always glibly told the public what it wants to hear and then sold them out. He was a prominent promoter and architect of a generation of federal, quote-unquote, tough-on-crime laws that militarize the nation's police and more than double the population of the prison system, the world's largest, with harsh, mandatory sentencing guidelines and laws that put people in prison for life for nonviolent drug crimes, even as his son struggled with addiction. He was a principal author of the Patriot Act, and there has never been a weapons system or a war he did not support. Nothing substantial will change under Biden, despite the hyperventilating about him being the next FDR. The Biden administration resembles the ineffectual German government formed by Franz von Papen in 1932 that sought to recreate the Ancien regime, a utopian conservatism that ensured Germany's drift into fascism. Biden is bereft, like von Papen, of new ideas and programs. He will keep the machinery of repression well-oiled, a machinery he was instrumental throughout his political career in constructing. Those that will resist will be attacked as agents of a foreign power and censored, as many already are being censored through algorithms and deplatforming on social media. And the most ardent dissidents, such as Julian Assange, will be criminalized. The established elites pretend that Trump was a freakish anomaly. They naively believe they can make Trump and his most vociferous supporters disappear by banishing them from social media. The Ancien regime will, they assert, return with the decorum of its imperial presidency, respect for procedural norms, elaborately choreographed elections, and fealty to neoliberal and imperial politics. But what the established ruling elites have yet to grasp, despite the narrow electoral victory Biden had over Trump and the storming of the Capitol on January 6th by an enraged mob, is that the credibility of the old order is dead. The Trump era, if not Trump himself, is, unless we break the stranglehold on corporate power, the future. The ruling elites, embodied by Biden and the Democratic Party, and the polite wing of the Republican Party, represented by Jeb Bush and Mitt Romney, is headed for the dustbin of history. The growing ressentiment of the dispossessed is stoked and fed by a mass media that has divided the public into competing demographics. Media platforms target one demographic, feeding its opinions and proclivities back to it, while shrilly demonizing the demographic on the other side of the political divide. This has proved commercially successful, but it has also split the country into irreconcilable warring factions that can no longer communicate. Truth and verifiable fact have been sacrificed. The Democratic Party, in a desperate bid to control the media narrative, has built an alliance with the social media industry giants such as Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Patreon, Substack, and Spotify to curtail or censor its critics. The goal is to herd the public back to Democratic Party-allied news organizations such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN. But these media outlets, which serve corporate advertisers, have rendered the lives of the working class and the poor invisible, and they are as reviled as the ruling elites themselves. The loss of credibility has given rise to new, often spontaneous groups, as well as the lunatic fringe that embraces conspiracy theories such as QAnon. They traffic in emotional outrage, often replacing one outrage with another. They provide new forms of identity to replace the identity lost by tens of millions of Americans who have been cast aside. This emotional outrage can be harnessed for laudable causes, such as ending police violence, but is too often ephemeral. It transforms political debate into grievance protests at best, and more often televised spectacle. These flash mobs pose no threat to the elites unless they build disciplined organizational structures which take years and articulate a vision of what can come next. And this is why I support Extinction Rebellion, which has a large grassroots network, especially in Europe, carries out effective, sustained acts of civil disobedience, and has a clearly stated goal of overthrowing the ruling elites and building a new governing system through people's committees and sortition. This emotional outrage, which put Trump in the White House, also stokes the fires of American sadism, especially among a white working class that feels dethroned and abandoned. The breakdown of our society is not only political, it is ecological. Scientists have long warned that as global temperatures rise, increasing precipitation and heat waves in many parts of the world, infectious diseases spread by animals will plague populations year-round and expand into northern regions. Zoonotic diseases, diseases that jump from animals to humans, such as HIV/AIDS, which has killed approximately 36 million people, avian flu, swine flu, Ebola, and COVID-19, which has already killed some 4 million people, will ripple across the globe in ever more virulent strains, often mutating beyond our control. The misuse of antibiotics in the animal agriculture industry, which accounts for 80% of all antibiotic use, has produced strains of bacteria that are antibiotic resistant and fatal. A modern version of the Black Death, which in the 14th century killed between 75 and 200 million people, wiping out perhaps half of Europe's population, is probably inevitable as long as the pharmaceutical and medical industries are configured to make money rather than protect and save lives. Even with vaccines, we lack the national infrastructure to distribute them efficiently because profit supersedes health. And those in the global south are, as usual, abandoned, as if the diseases that kill them will never reach us. Israel's decision to distribute COVID-19 vaccines to as many as 19 countries while refusing to vaccinate the 5 million Palestinians living under its occupation is emblematic of the ruling elite's stunning myopia, not to mention immorality. What is taking place is not neglect. It is not ineptitude. It is not policy failure. It is social murder. It is murder because it is premeditated. It is murder because a conscious choice was made by the global ruling classes to extinguish life rather than protect it. It is murder because profit, despite the hard statistics, the growing climate disruptions, and the scientific modeling, is deemed more important than human survival. The global elites thrive in this system as long as they serve the dictates of what Lewis Mumford called the mega machine. The convergence of science, economy, technology, and political power united into an integrated, bureaucratic structure whose sole goal is to perpetuate itself. This structure, Mumford noted, is antithetical to life-enhancing values. But to challenge the mega machine, to name and condemn its death wish, is to be expelled from its inner sanctum. There are no doubt some within the mega machine who fear the future, who are appalled by the social murder, who worry what will happen to their children. but they do not want to lose their jobs and their social status to become pariahs. The U.S. military, which accounts for 38% of military spending worldwide, is, of course, incapable of combating the grave existential crisis before us. The fighter jets, satellites, aircraft carriers, fleets of warships, nuclear submarines, missiles, tanks, and vast arsenals of weaponry are useless against pandemics and the climate crisis. The war machine, which is spending $1.2 trillion to modernize our nuclear arsenal, does nothing to mitigate the human suffering caused by degraded environments that sicken and poison populations or make life unsustainable. Air pollution already kills an estimated 200,000 Americans a year, while children in decayed cities such as Flint, Michigan, are damaged for life with lead contamination from drinking water. And on top of all this, the U.S. military emitted 1.2 billion metric tons of carbon emissions between 2001 and 2017, twice the annual output of the nation's passenger vehicles. Future generations, if there are any, will look back at the current global ruling class as the most criminal in human history, willfully dooming billions of people to mass death. These crimes are being committed in front of us, and with few exceptions, we are being herded like sheep to the slaughter. The radical evil that makes this social murder possible is perpetrated by the colorless bureaucrats and technocrats churned out of business schools, law schools, management programs, and elite universities. Demonic non-entities. These systems managers carry out the incremental tasks that make the vast, complicated systems of exploitation and death work. They collect, store, and manipulate our personal data for digital monopolies and the security and surveillance state. They grease the wheels for ExxonMobil, BP, and Goldman Sachs. They write the laws passed by the bought and paid for political class. They pilot the aerial drones that terrorize the poor in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan. They profit from the endless wars. They are the corporate advertisers, public relations specialists, and television pundits that flood the airwaves with lies. They run the banks, they oversee the prisons, they issue the forms, they process the papers, they denied food stamps and medical coverage to some and unemployment benefits to others. They carry out the evictions, they enforce the laws and the regulations, they do not ask questions. They live in an intellectual vacuum, a world of stifling minutia. They are T.S. Eliot's hollow men, stuffed men, shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. These systems managers made possible the genocides of the past. They kept the trains running. They filled out the paperwork. They seized the property and confiscated the bank accounts. They did the processing. They rationed the food. They administered the concentration camps and the gas chambers. They enforced the law. They did their jobs. These systems managers, uneducated in all but their tiny technical specialty, lack the language and moral autonomy to question the reigning assumptions or structures. The Russian novelist Vasily Grossman, in his book Forever Flowing, observed that the new state did not require holy apostles, fanatic, inspired builders, faithful, devout disciples. The new state did not even require servants, just clerks. This metaphysical ignorance, the product of an educational system that is primarily vocational, greases the cogs for the culture of sadism and social murder. We will not extract ourselves from predatory capitalism and its culture of sadism with meager government handouts. We will not extract ourselves because Biden's slick speechwriters, and public relations specialists who use polls and focus groups to feed back to us what we want to hear can make us feel the administration is on our side. There is no goodwill in the Biden White House, the Congress, the courts, the media, which has become an echo chamber of the privileged classes or corporate boardrooms. They are the enemy. We will extract ourselves from this culture of sadism, the way the dispossessed extracted themselves from the stranglehold of crony capitalism during the Great Depression, by organizing, protesting, and disrupting the system until the ruling elites are forced to grant a measure of social and economic justice. The bonus army World War I veterans who had been denied pension payments set up huge encampments in Washington, which were violently dispersed by the army. Neighborhood groups, many of them members of the Wobblies or the Communist Party, in the 1930s physically prevented sheriff departments from evicting families. In 1936 and 1937, the United Auto Workers carried out a sit-down strike inside factories that crippled General Motors, forcing the company to recognize the union, raise wages, and meet union demands for job protection and safe working conditions. Farmers, forced into bankruptcy and foreclosures by the big banks in Wall Street, founded the Farmers Holiday Association to protest the seizure of family farms. One of the reasons bank robbers such as John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, and the Barker Gang were folk heroes. The farmers blocked roads and destroyed mountains of farm products, reducing supply and raising prices. The farmers, like unionized auto workers, endured widespread government surveillance and violent attacks from the FBI, company goons, hired gun thugs, militias, and sheriff's departments. But the militancy worked. The farmers forced the state to accept a de facto moratorium on farm foreclosures. Mass demonstrations outside state capitals at the same time pressured state legislatures to block the collection of overdue mortgage payments. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers in the South unionized. The Department of Labor called their collective action, quote, a miniature civil war, end quote. The unemployed and the hungry throughout the country squatted in vacant homes and on vacant land, forming shanty towns that were known as Hoovervilles. The destitute took over public buildings and public utilities. This constant pressure, not the goodwill of FDR, created the New Deal. He and his fellow oligarchs understood that if there was not reform, there would be revolution, something Roosevelt acknowledged in his private correspondence. It is not until people are reintegrated into society, not until corporate and oligarchic control over our educational, political, and media systems are removed, not until we recover the ethic of the common good, that we have any hope of rebuilding the positive social bonds that foster a healthy society. History has amply illustrated how this process works. It is a game of fear. And until we make the ruling elites afraid, until a terrified Joe Biden and the oligarchs he served look out on a sea of pitchforks, we will not blunt the culture of sadism and social murder they have engineered. Rebellion, however, must be its own justification. It is a moral imperative, not a practical one. It not only erodes, however imperceptibly, the structures of oppression, but it sustains the embers of empathy and compassion as well as justice within us that defy the sadism that colors every layer of our existence. In short, it keeps us human. Rebellion must be embraced finally, not only for what it will achieve, but for what it will allow us to become. And in that becoming, we find hope. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Chris. We are taking questions from the audience right now. So if anyone wants to write in, we are taking questions both live and from the Zoom stream. So also for people right here. I'm so used to prepping everyone for Zoom, but if any of you have questions, I can come up with the microphone. I guess a first question I have for you that I was just thinking about as I was listening is that to a certain extent, all of the information that you include, all of the history that you include in the speech, and the contextualization of that, it's almost like you are a storyteller for the people who are open-minded enough to listen to you. In some ways, like if you're the type of person who reads and listens to Chris Hedges, then there's this openness, and in some ways you're framing history for us and contextualizing the current social and political moment. So I'm just wondering if you've ever seen yourself in that role, given that you include detailed historical accounts in all of your speeches. I don't know if you've ever considered yourself a storyteller, but also maybe talking about the weirdness of that for you in terms of also knowing that beyond that circle of people who would be open to the vision of Chris Hedges, there's this whole other world that you are unpacking.
Well, history is a story, and it's our story. But of course, as many great philosophers of history have understood, the dominant, Howard Zinn has written about this among others, the dominant forces seek to form a story that justifies, buttresses, and even glorifies their grip on power. And so all tyrannies, Hannah Arendt writes about this, seek to impose a kind of historical amnesia on a subjugated population because they don't want that population to remember, to know where it came from. And you see that always campaigns of genocide, whether it's carried out against African Americans, what was the first thing that happened when Africans were brought to the shores? Their names were taken from them, their language was taken from them. You see it with native communities, indigenous communities. There's always a cultural genocide that accompanies tyranny. And I think that cultural genocide is quite pronounced now within the United States. I think that we don't know where we came from. I'm not talking about the official narrative of great white men like FDR who saved us, which is just factually incorrect. It's all of those forces that forced the ruling elites to respond. They will always take credit for it. I didn't see the film Lincoln, but I didn't watch it because I read that Frederick Douglass doesn't make an appearance in the film Lincoln. How can you write about emancipation and not write about or not acknowledge that it was figures like Douglass who pushed Lincoln and the ruling elites to end slavery? Remember, Lincoln was not an abolitionist. The abolitionists were outliers, people that they dismissed as utopians. And yet by the end of the war, everything the abolitionists called for came to pass, which was the complete eradication of slavery. So I think that keeping ourselves grounded in our own history is absolutely fundamental. One of the things you read Emma Goldman, and they're working 12 hours a day in sweatshops in the Lower East Side, but then they're going to radical Yiddish study groups in the evening. And one of the things we've lost with the union movement, and we forget, is that there was a huge component of education within the union movement. And that's done by design. The design is to sever ourselves from our own history. I taught a people's history of the United States in a prison in New Jersey. The room was filled with mostly poor, I think completely poor black men. And Zinn, who's very cognizant of the African American experience from the start of the Republic all the way through, was telling their story, Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech and Malcolm X, etc., and they were riveted. In fact, I would be giving these talks from the book, and I would hear them go, damn, we've been lied to. And they have been lied to, and that's by design. So part of control, Gramsci writes about this, is essentially keeping an oppressed population ignorant of their own history. But now, under corporate oppression, I think that we don't know how we got here. I mean, American society was created as a closed system which disenfranchised large numbers of people, landless, blacks, Native Americans, women. It created the Electoral College. It used to be that senators were appointed. It was all done to thwart, they were quite open about it, by slaveholding white aristocrats, to thwart popular democracy. And every advance that we made, as in Chronicles, and often paid for by blood, we had the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers were murdered, hundreds. Tens of thousands were blacklisted. Was paid for, whether it was the civil rights movement, the suffragists. There was a high cost that was paid to open up that society. And after the Vietnam War and the rise of not just the anti-war movement, but the feminist movement, indigenous movements, the civil rights movement, the ruling elites, as Samuel Huntington wrote, wanted to respond to what he called the excess of democracy, and they've quite effectively now carried out a corporate coup d'etat. And part of that is making sure we don't remember where we came from and how we got here and who it was that opened up our society for us.
Thank you for all of that. Thinking about a lot of things now, but we have some questions coming in. Once again, you giving us the kind of you are here on the map, you know? But thank you for addressing the fact that corporate culture is purposefully obfuscating all this stuff. This family wrote in, I removed my kids from their public school. I look back on my public school civics and history as simple white supremacy myth. Women and people of color play no role. My daughter said in her school they spent 1 day on American Indians and 2 days on the buffalo. James Baldwin said we can take our kids off their buses. We can take them out of their schools. What can you suggest, or what can someone as well educated as you suggest about education?
Well, public education in America was once perhaps the crown jewel of American democracy, and it has been assaulted and destroyed through a variety of mechanisms. So you have in depressed communities failing schools by design, because schools are paid for by property taxes, and because the ruling elites feel that people in poor communities only need to learn numerical literacy to work at low-end, low-wage jobs. That's all they need. And so that's all they get. And then you go to universities like Princeton, and I've taught at Princeton, and there you get people who also are integrated vocationally into the system as the dominant systems managers. The largest major at Princeton and at Harvard is computer science. So it's all vocational. The humanities are under complete assault because, and the ruling elites understand, and they're not wrong in this, that the humanities, when they're taught correctly, are subversive. They are meant to teach you how to think, not what to think. They are meant to give you the language to question reigning assumptions. And so even in major universities, all of the humanities are withering away at major universities like Princeton or Harvard, but then at state universities, they do that by flooding departments or demanding that departments raise corporate money not only for their research but often for their salaries. And then those that teach the humanities, 70+% are now adjuncts who make $4,000 a course. That's barely above the poverty line if they teach 4 courses a semester. And they have no protection. They don't get tenure. These are non-tenure track positions. They don't have a union. And so they have to be very careful about what they say, or they're pushed out. So I look at the broad assault at every level within American education as one of the most destructive forces to American democracy. And it doesn't matter whether it's at Princeton or in a public school in Troy, New York. I know you teach in a public school, and I think teachers I think it's one of the most heroic professions we have in our society. But the pressure, and of course a lot of it, if you go to schools that are funneling kids into college, it's all, the course curriculum is all predetermined by largely for-profit entities. So that's not an accident. They understand very well what they're doing. And I think that's been one of the major contributors to the breakdown of American democracy.
This person has 2 questions. Their name is Jawred. The first one is, what do you make of America's growing tensions with China?
Well, I mean, the problem with a military is that devours such significant amount of resources. They need to justify themselves. And they do that by creating conflicts, whether one needs to be created or not. So for instance, Reagan had promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand beyond Germany's borders. NATO has now expanded all through Eastern Europe up to Russia's borders. Why? Because that means billions upon billions of dollars for the arms industry. So when I was in Warsaw, I got off at the airport, and there were giant billboards, not only in the airport, but on the way into Warsaw, from Raytheon. Because those East European armies have to become compatible with NATO weapon systems. So you don't want your military determining global relations, diplomacy, or how you cooperate or function with competing power centers, because they know how to do only one thing, and that's fight wars. That's their business. And there are a lot of people that make a lot of money off it. I mean, the only thing we really make anymore are weapons. But there's no accountability control at all over the military. They don't even allow themselves to be audited. Nobody even challenges a weapon system. It doesn't matter how many billions of dollars they squander on warships that don't work, or it doesn't make any difference. And even Biden increases the military budget, and Trump increased it by 10%, and the Pentagon didn't even ask for a 10% increase. So if you look at the collapse of any imperial power, it's a rapacious, out-of-control military machine. That's what typified ancient Rome. They mounted a 1 million man army. That's what doomed the Habsburg Empire. That's what doomed the Kaiser and the German Empire. It's what doomed most of the monarchies of Europe. Because that military apparatus seized complete control and was no longer able to be contained. And that's where we are. So that's why. It's a business. It's a good business. It don't make any sense. It's extremely dangerous. Just, the expansion of NATO alone is extremely dangerous. I mean, we have, I think it's, 170 bases of some kind. I can't remember the full number. I mean, but what we should also note is that there is a huge move on the part of major powers like China, Russia, and others to sever themselves from the dollar as the reserve currency. And we also know, because it happened to the pound sterling in the 50s to Britain, that when the dollar is no longer the world's reserves currency, the American economy goes into free fall. The dollar is worth about a third of its value, imports become prohibitive, and the extension of empire can no longer be maintained. Now, Alfred McCoy, the historian, has written quite a bit about this. He actually puts a date when he thinks that's going to happen. I think that's pretty dangerous. But we're certainly moving in that direction. And all you have to do is look at what happened in the 50s when the world's reserve currency shifted from the pound sterling to the dollar and the devastation it caused in the British economy. And that, I think McCoy is right, will be the final kind of nail in the coffin of the American empire.
Okay. Well, this is also by the same person who asked that question, Jared Tolbert, and they ask, also, I've heard you say Trump was too incompetent to stage a successful coup, yet his conspirators came within hundreds of seconds of taking a member of Congress hostage, presumably in an attempt to use them as a bargaining chip to overturn election results. Seeing how not very much is being done about this, shouldn't everyone who is complicit in making January 6th happen be feeling pretty good about themselves at this moment?
I don't think the word insurrection or coup is correct. I've actually lived through various coups and insurrections. First of all, they weren't armed. What did they do? They got inside the chambers and were taking selfies of themselves in Mike Pence's chair. There didn't appear to be spontaneous. It didn't appear to have any real plan. They would have been easily surrounded by military forces. They didn't have weapons by which they could, and even if they did, they wouldn't have been able to survive a siege. They didn't have any support within the military. I think that they were an enraged mob. I think they certainly would have loved to have grabbed Nancy Pelosi. I don't in any way disagree that certain members of Congress were in real physical danger, but it struck me as a mob, not as a coup. I lived through coups in Latin America. Those things are coordinated, well planned in advance, and they have military muscle behind them.
This person writes in, their name is Thursday Next, and maybe you can interpret what they're asking, but they say, can you speak to infrastructure with respect to toxic masculinity or sadism? I'm not sure how they're using the word infrastructure.
Social infrastructure, maybe?
I'm not sure. Infrastructure with respect to toxic masculinity.
I mean, I would say toxic masculinity is cultural. Pornography is, exhibit A. The lust for violence, the fetishizing weapons, which is very much a part of American culture. The notion that masculinity is about the power to completely dominate or eradicate the other. This is fed to us by Hollywood. It's fed to us on video games. It's just ubiquitous, frankly. And that hyper-masculinity is an element always, of course, of sadism, of a sadistic culture. There are writers I think pretty prescient writers of fascism who argue that fascism in and itself has no coherent ideology, but is just driven by an emotionally driven celebration of hypermasculinity. But we certainly, our society is infused with a very dangerous hypermasculinity, which is really about shutting off empathy, compassion, the ability to nurture, to care. All of these qualities are defined, as quote-unquote feminine, and therefore denigrated, and certainly denigrated within mass media.
This question is from Terry Rankin. Could you speak more, Chris, to the failure of the church in America to be on the front lines of these proliferating and intensifying existential threats and, frankly, spiritual warfare?
Yeah, we're talking about the liberal church, which I come out of. My father was a Presbyterian minister. My mother was a seminary graduate and a college professor, and I graduated from Harvard Divinity School, and I don't broadcast it, but I'm actually an ordained Presbyterian minister. The church completely checked out. It did it two ways. One, it followed the zeitgeist of the culture, so that spirituality became, it was this kind of how is it with me spirituality, which is just narcissism. It severed itself from I think the bedrock calls for justice and for the oppressed, with maybe the singular exception of James Cone, the greatest theologian in America since Reinhold Niebuhr. It busied itself with the search for the quote-unquote historical Jesus. There is no historical Jesus. I read all these theological texts, and in every time period, historians, we used to read a theologian called Rudolf Bultmann, who was an existentialist, and of course made Jesus an existentialist. Albert Schweitzer actually wrote a good book on this around 1906, where he looked at all of these movements. So you see it with these people who are obsessed with the Gnostic Gospels. It's about creating a belief system in your own image. But the liberal church became like the liberal class. And I wrote a book called Death of the Liberal Class, and the church rendered itself irrelevant because it became incredibly inward. It was focused inward. It was focused on itself, and it forgot that as Martin Buber says, that in the end it's not about us, it's about our neighbor. It forgot.
I was just thinking again, do you ever think, just zooming out as far, I don't even know what this point would be, but as far as you can go as a human and zooming out on our situation here on planet Earth. I was just thinking about death of the liberal class and the corruption of all of these liberal institutions, the church, school, press, culture itself, politics, that's the one, the Democratic Party. And, just then you have the climate crisis, then you have the lunacy of the far right and the Republican Party in general now. So I guess in going to that meta zoomed out perspective, are you ever surprised at where we're at? Like, I'm sure you have the feeling sometimes when you're writing of channeling a little bit or listening to a higher force or power even within yourself of what you're writing about. But do you just ever have the feeling after you compose one of these speeches of, okay, this is where we're at?
I'm not surprised. I'm just depressed. I don't want to be right. I'd like to be proved wrong. But I think in the end, my training is as a newspaper reporter. And I found that there were two types of reporters. There were those reporters that knew what tomorrow's story was, and those that didn't. So I was working for the New York Times overseas. I had to compete with very fine reporters from the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, AP. And I never worried about those reporters, which were the majority, who couldn't figure out what tomorrow's story was. I was always terrified of those reporters I was up against who did know what tomorrow's story was. And the reason was because I didn't live, eat, and breathe news. While everybody would go to the bar and drink to keep talking about the stories they'd spent all day covering, I was in my room reading Proust. And that put me at a disadvantage. So I think that it is that ability for whether it's intuitive, it may be partly intuitive. I think a lot of it has to do with understanding human nature and how human nature works, understanding systems of power and how they work. But I think that good reporters know. And I certainly had that quality. And so, no, I'm not surprised. But I'm not happy about being proven right.
Well, thank you. Andrea B. writes in, it seems there's two energies in the world. Evil is never going to go away. It's a constant energy. Is evil fear? Or is it much more than that? Is it greed, power hunger, and how can fear be kept in check?
No, evil is not fear. Fear let's go to war. In societies at war, first of all, fear is utterly pervasive. It's one of the reasons why you can't replicate the reality of war in a film, in images, because you've extracted from those who are watching it the predominant feeling, which is fear, along with the sounds and the smells and everything else. And the chaos. The other thing about combat is that it's utter confusion. You only know what's happening around you, a tiny perimeter around you. And what takes place after a firefight is that you actually construct a story to explain what happened. But at the moment you don't even know. When I was a prisoner in Basra, I was with a light armor battalion. We were ambushed, 16 hours of combat. And I remember, even in small arms engagements, you have a very hard time figuring out where the firing is coming from. I mean, a lot of your time is just that simple task of trying to figure out where the line of fire is coming from. So fear is pervasive. Evil is not fear. And fear keeps most people passive. Susan Sontag used to say 10% of people are good, 10% of people are evil, and the rest can go either way. But fear, especially in societies that lose credibility, fear becomes the primary mechanism of control. I mean, a lot of people don't know that historically, certainly in the rise to power, Mussolini was far more violent and brutal than the Nazis. But it's that random act. Solzhenitsyn writes about this. Hannah Arendt writes about this. It's that person that suddenly Zach disappears, and you don't know why. It's about the creation of terror or fear as a mechanism of control. I mean, radical evil. I think Kant and others who've written about radical evil are right. Or Freud. I mean, it is the death instinct. It is about the negation of the other, the dehumanization of the other, the turning the other into an object. And once people are turned into objects, then you've essentially given yourself a moral license to both manipulate and destroy because they're less than human. And that's evil. It is the denial of the humanity of the other, the inability to see yourself in the other. And that becomes a process by which that leads to the extermination of the other. Why is racism evil? Because racism is about denying the humanity of the other, and then the consequences of that are, unchecked, lethal violence by militarized police, lynching, the long litany of crimes that have been committed against African Americans in this country. I guess that's evil.
And the way that language is always used to achieve that.
It always is the precursor to the destruction of the other. You have to demonize the other, and once the other is demonized as a contaminant within the society, it's a very short step towards their physical eradication.
This will be my last question because I don't want to hog it, but I think it'll be a good segue into the next question here, which is just with what you were just saying about objectification of an other, or even all life itself. I mean, I think even what we do to animals, and then the breakdown of the value of life there. In some ways, with corporate capitalism, it's almost like you have an inverse, it's like a photographic negative of, in other words, if the corporate state is about objectification, then you could see why in terms of your analysis and all the different aspects of life that you pull in, why all of these systems are failing. Because if, you know, the corporation is the top of the hegemonic pyramid here, then the corporate MO is essentially about objectification.
Completely,
you know, it's a machine
because we're
to
all
just,
commodities.
Yeah.
We're commodities.
Yeah.
To exhaust, to exploit until exhaustion or collapse. That's it. And that ethos has now just permeated the entire society.
Yeah, so in the case of that, this person writes in the Bull Moose is their online name. It says, do you think it would ever be possible, as our society is currently organized, or given these contexts, to organize a movement powerful enough to actually make the ruling class fear and force them to respond?
Yes, that was done in the 1960s, which is why the ruling classes made war on everything the 60s built, starting with Ralph Nader, who I'm close to. I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter when he was running for president. Yes, they saw those movements and they were terrified. I mean, look at the Occupy movement, which Zach was very involved in, and Zuccotti. The Occupy movement terrified the elites, which is why there was a coordinated effort led by Barack Obama to physically eradicate all the Occupy movements. That's why the state expended tremendous resources in terms of infiltrating it and monitoring it. And yet, when history is written, what the demands of the Occupy movement were not particularly radical. They were just, not only were they reasonable, but they actually articulated what most of the country wants. I think that was a terrible mistake on the part of the ruling elites. So yes, we can, and you don't actually need a huge, you need a percentage of people willing to go out into the street, but we're talking 1 to 3%. I remember talking to Jesse Jackson about marches at Birmingham, and I made a comment about the courage of the hundreds of civil rights activists who were willing to, and he started laughing. He said, hundreds? He said, there's a couple dozen. You know, whether it was the freedom rides, whether it was the people standing up to Bull Connor's dogs, they weren't large in number, but they didn't back down. And they became, through their physical courage, our moral conscience. So yes, I pray for it every night, because that's our only hope. If we're already facing climate catastrophe, even if we stop all carbon emissions today. And we have no time left to fool around. But this is the only mechanism that has any chance of saving us, is one that we've seen before. And that is building mass movements that frighten the elites and that may not have incorporate the participation of the vast majority, but act as their conscience. And I would say that even with Occupy's Act, that was true at the beginning. People were sending pizzas, and I mean, Occupy acted in many ways as the conscience, and not just for the kids who were there, but for all sorts of people who didn't have jobs, who were foreclosed from their homes, who were, you know, crippled by student debt, trapped in low-wage jobs. Yeah.
Well, this next question would get at the traps of liberalism and what's going on now with in relation to any resistance movements. This is from Josh Carlin, and he asks, can you speak about Biden's new anti-terrorism measure that classifies socialists and those that oppose capitalism as domestic terrorists? And you mentioned in the speech being for Extinction Rebellion, and they mentioned something in that also about environmental groups that they deem too extreme.
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember Biden was selected by the ruling elites that didn't want Sanders, although Sanders is hardly a radical. He never took on the military machine. But you had major donors in the Democratic Party, Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, and others, made it very clear that if somehow Sanders was the nominee, they would vote for Trump. Now, the ruling elites didn't like Trump. He was an embarrassment. He's inept. He has the attention span of a 3-year-old. He's a megalomaniac, all the reasons we don't like Trump. But they can live with Trump. What was the question again? I'm sorry.
Well, just in terms of just any of your feelings about the fact that Biden did do this new...
Well, Biden, yeah. So Biden was selected because he would be a trusted custodian of the systems of power. I mean, that's why he was picked. And not only that, his entire political career is an illustration of that. So, of course, they're going to blow a lot of smoke at you. That's what they're good at. Obama did it for 8 years. Obama's assault on civil liberties were worse than those carried out by George W. Bush. And I sued him in federal court over one of his actions, the Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. But he reinterpreted the Authorization to Use Military Force Act as giving the executive branch the right to order the assassination of U.S. citizens, Anwar al-Awlaki. He used the Espionage Act 9 times. It had only been used 3 times, from 1917 when it was written until 2009 when Obama took office against whistleblowers. Obama used it 9 times to shut down whistleblowers. So, and Biden was part of this, an integral part of this process. I mean, go back and read Biden's stuff on the war on crime in the 90s. It's blood-curdling. I mean, it's really appalling. He brags about increasing federal death penalty crimes to 51. I think they'd been 2 or 3 before. He brags about it. It was all this super predator rhetoric. I teach in a prison, and half of my students would not be in that prison but for Clinton and Biden. And I can't, I just walk out of there. The numbers of lives that Biden is responsible for destroying in this country alone, and the families that he devastated. He should never be forgiven for that. But, whether it's Israel, these people are very skilled at manipulating the message. But you've got to look at what they do and shut down the message. And the person who tipped me off on Obama was Dennis Kucinich, who gave me Obama's voting record, 2-year voting record in the Senate. He said, you got to read it. There is just not a corporate giveaway that this guy didn't support. He even supported the death penalty. And then Dennis said, when he went to baseball games in Cleveland, I'm imitating Dennis, the ushers would go up and down the aisles saying, get your scorecard, get your scorecard. That's like the numbers for all the players. That's all you look at. Everything else is a mirage. And that's what you got to do with Biden. But, most people don't look. Most people are passive consumers of information, and almost all information is corporate garbage.
This person writes in, Shannon, have you been following what Governor DeSantis is doing in Florida, putting forward legislation that would require universities to survey students and professors to determine their political ideology, which would allow him to cut funding for schools who are too, quote, liberal-leaning? Do you think competent fascists like him are likely to win in 2024 since Biden is failing?
I think that without the kinds of radical reforms that can reintegrate significant segments of the American population back into the system, to reknit the social bonds that have been broken, Biden's legacy will be the rise of a competent fascism. That would probably not be embodied in Trump. I don't know. Mike Pompeo, who knows? We may not know the name yet. Tom Cotton. We were saved by Trump's incompetence and ineptitude. But Trump was responding to a phenomena. He didn't create it. Trump was the symptom, not the disease. And if we don't address the disease, then what's left of our very anemic democracy will be extinguished. And I fear that Biden's legacy will be like von Papen, to try and reach back to recreate a neoliberal ancien regime embodied in figures like Clinton, Bush, Obama, that across the political spectrum people aren't buying.
Your thoughts on solutions journalism and how it may factor into all of this? That was from Bernice Green.
Well, let's just drop the word solutions. Journalism is a dying phenomenon. You see it in the consolidation of corporate control of newsrooms, the massive layoffs. You see it in the algorithms that marginalize writers such as myself on the internet. So when the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop are published by the New York Post is locked out of its own Twitter account. The walls are closing in on those of us who confront corporate and imperial power. I was once about as mainstream as you could get. And this kind of critique is totally unpalatable now, even on the margins of the internet. And that's not conjecture, because I was at Truthdig with Bob Scheer, and the publisher tried to fire Scheer. We went on strike. She fired all of us. But right before then, the IT people did a graph on terms of impressions. So that means that impressions are like if you went to Google and you typed in imperialism, and I had typed in an article about imperialism recently, it would come up with everything else. So the algorithms mean that I don't come up. And so there was a decline in terms of referrals by impressions over a 12-month period that dropped from over 700,000 to below 200,000, or probably even below that now. So, and that's why I have a show on RT, because I can't, this kind of critique is not palatable on MSNBC or anywhere else. It's the same reason I used, when I covered Czechoslovakia, if I wanted to listen to Václav Havel, I had to listen to Voice of America. And Havel was a socialist, he didn't support American imperialism, but it was the only platform that he had. So I worry about, the corrosion of journalism. I think that the large mainstream media organizations have just become cheerleaders for one side or the other. We know that from a Pew poll. 94% of the people who watch MSNBC identify as registered Democrats, 91% who subscribe to the New York Times, 87% who listen to NPR, and on Fox, it's the opposite. But this is what I saw in the former Yugoslavia. The media system breaks down, and you no longer have a common vocabulary based on verifiable fact by which people can communicate, and that led to fratricide. And that's what's happening. Now, it's very profitable. This is a profit model. It's a commercial model, but it's very dangerous, both for journalism and for our democracy.
I know you have children. I hope you don't mind me bringing that up. And, I teach young people and have many young people in my life who I love. Do you find it difficult to talk to young people? I remember being little, and you just think about children's storybooks and the way that you want to raise a child to feel like there's all of this hope and love and possibility in life. And if you really think about, again, all of these different facets that you're drawing together, the last talk you gave here was the politics of despair, and now this one is American sadism. And one thing that I really appreciate, again, about your writing is that you are on this sensitive nerve of the sociological implications of all of this. What it means to not only have all of these political things happening, or essentially this corruption happening, but also the way it impacts interpersonal dynamics, how people relate to each other. So, do you have your own feelings for how you communicate with young people, given what the situation on the ground is? And B, also, do you think about, I was thinking about Kierkegaard before, desire, and you have the words despair and now sadism, and how these conditions, they cut into our desire, not just bodily desire, but I'm speaking in the full sense of the word. So yeah, just wondering, because that relates to how a child is raised too. You raise a child to feel like they can have full capacity of desire. So first just thinking about kids, and then also your thoughts on desire.
Well, I became a vegan for environmental reasons. That it was, and you should all watch Cowspiracy, a goofy title, but it's a good movie, because I realized the extent to which the animal agriculture industry was contributing to global warming and the breakdown of the environment, and it was something I could wake up the next morning and do. And so my kids are vegan, and they know why they're vegan. And I think that being honest about what it is we face, but then giving them something that they can do, becomes a way of giving them a sense of empowerment. I certainly speak about climate change. I probably don't give them Clive Hamilton's book, but I think we have to acknowledge that reality. And I think they fully understand that we have to do everything in our power to thwart these forces. I mean, the Amazon rainforest is largely cut down for soy to feed animals. And it doesn't mean we'll change the world. It doesn't mean most people will become vegan, but we have to accept individual responsibility and take individual action.
This will be the last question. This is from Gregory Michael Hernandez. Says, do you think George Packer's new book is a helpful assessment?
Don't get me started on George Packer. I mean, one of the cheerleaders for the war in Iraq, and attacking me personally because I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I speak Arabic, and I sacrificed my career at the Times for denouncing the war, and Packer went after me by name because I didn't care about the people of Iraq. I didn't want the people of Iraq liberated. So I don't read Packer. He's part of that liberal elite I excoriate in Death of the Liberal Class.
Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you for speaking tonight. Oh, any questions from the audience? Oh, sure. Yeah.
So this question is from Dee Collins. She couldn't make it. Is it possible to go into public office and do it differently, or are politicians pressured to fall in line?
Well, they're either pressured to fall in line, and AOC has fallen into line, or they're gotten rid of, the way Dennis Kucinich was gotten rid of when the Democratic machine in Ohio did redistricting so that he wouldn't get reelected to the House. I think that there should be, I've voted for the Green Party since 2000. I don't vote for Democrats, but change won't come through electoral politics. It will come off the street. And it's good to have third-party candidates that articulate positions we care about, but we're not going to affect the system through elections. I mean, I vote. That great quote from Emma Goldman, if voting was that effective, it would be illegal. It's just not that effective. What's effective is building, as we saw in the 60s, anti-war movements, women's movements, environmental movements. That's what's effective. And keeping politicians in check, making them afraid. And so we almost have to start from scratch because all of our popular movements have been decimated by design. And we have to rebuild them. And it's one of the reasons why I have so much respect for Sanctuary, because it's going to be rebuilt in localities. It's going to, like these seeds, that's where it's going to come from. It's not going to come floating down from on high.
There is any politicians that have been successful in radical reform that you can provide?
I mean, there are socialists. We talked before about Peña Gomez, who I admired. I mean, they're there, but the forces arrayed against them, as you know, are fierce. So, what happens to Rafael Correa in Ecuador? We still have a blockade of Cuba. This is nuts. The latest, in the UN, they just had a vote to lift the blockade. Every country on earth voted to lift, I think it's a 60-year-old blockade, except for the United States and Israel. What happened in Cuba, the imperial power just doesn't forgive. So, yes, there are, but those political leaders, I would argue, like Dennis. I think Dennis is a person of integrity. He was driven out of his office as mayor of Cleveland when the business community organized against him, threw the city into default, and then in Congress when the Democratic machine redistricted, so he couldn't, in a way that they knew he wouldn't be reelected. What happened to McGovern? McGovern gets the nomination in 1972, and you have the hierarchy of the Republican and the Democratic parties uniting to destroy McGovern. Henry Wallace, 1948, the same. We're not going anywhere without movements. And it's not that there aren't political figures out there who are honest. It's just that without those movements, they're powerless.
Thank you.
Oh, did you have a question, Mr. Terry?
Yeah, you mentioned things that the Biden administration wouldn't do or couldn't do or wouldn't do. What I want to ask is there anything at this point that we should endorse that administration is doing? Is there anything?
Well, the Biden administration is undoing through executive orders some of the damage that Trump has done, all of which is good. I support it. But my fundamental point is that unless the Biden administration deals with these deep structural deformities, we're finished. And they're not doing that. Biden campaigned on a stimulus check for every American family of $2,000. That vanished. Biden campaigned on $15 minimum wage. That vanished. Biden campaigned on the public option. That vanished. That's not new for the Democratic Party. But if we don't begin to build those structural reforms to mitigate the deep inequities within the society, then Biden's legacy will be a competent fascist.
Well, how do you feel about the question of voter suppression?
Well, voter suppression is the tool the Republican Party has embraced to essentially one of the tools that they've embraced to take control in the next election. And given how narrow the elections are, and given the fact that I think many people are going to be frustrated with the Biden administration, we may see the first defeat may be flipping the House, which I think now many people predict that the Republicans, which are clearly an anti-democratic party, but they're both corporate parties. And they define their differences over cultural issues. They don't fight over the defense budget. The Democrats aren't promising to end wholesale government surveillance. I mean, they fight over what Freud called the narcissism of minor difference. Yes, the Democrats are more palatable culturally. They're not overtly racist. But I tell my students in the prison, some will say, well, nobody ever called me, insulted me. And I'll say, well, you describe to me your school in Camden, New Jersey. And then I say, okay, now I'm going to tell you about the public school in Princeton, New Jersey, that has an Olympic swimming pool and a black box theater that cost $1 million. And I said, that's racism. That's institutional, that's still racism. And those are the kinds of things that have to be dealt with, and Biden's not dealing with it.
Speaking of racism, this is the last question. Do you consider racism as a technique of sadism?
Yes,
And
of
if
course
so, what do you think we could do to stop the continuing divide in the freedom movement that's pushing for democracy for all people?
Well, I mean, part of the problem is that the stories of the working poor and even the working class are invisible in the media landscape because commercial advertisers don't make money from them, so the media doesn't report them. So if huge segments of your population have been rendered invisible, essentially they've been neutered in terms of not only having a voice, but being able to build empathy for their experience. And that contributes, especially with the siloing of demographics into competing media centers, that makes it almost impossible to counter. I mean, racism is about stereotyping. It's totally fictional, but it is about creating a racial stereotype. And that is broken by actually knowing people who are confined within that stereotype, because when you really know them, then of course you realize that the stereotype is ridiculous. But we're living in a society where, especially in the media landscape, and I would say in terms of the economic landscape. So, societies are segregated. I live in New Jersey. It's one of the most segregated states in America. I live in Princeton. Are there black people in Princeton? Yeah, there are. They teach at Princeton. But Camden is 94%, 96% people of color. It's the poorest city per capita in the United States, but you don't even drive through it on the way to Philly because they built an overpass, so you drive over it. So people don't ever see it. And that's a fundamental contributor to racism. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thanks for the folks who came out here in person tonight and for everybody out in internet land on YouTube and Zoom. Really want to thank Chris for his courage and vision, making his 6th trip up the Hudson River Valley, the heart of darkness, to come and speak to us and share your perspective on human events. I can't thank the folks who are here tonight enough for coming out, especially the folks who are doing the production. It's really been amazing, and we know you have lots of other things to do on this hot evening, but we appreciate you all. And we appreciate the people who sustain the sanctuary by becoming sanctuary sustainers. For those of you who are not familiar with us, go to our website, mediasanctuary.org, and if you like what we do, help us do it. Become a sanctuary sustainer. Thanks very much. Keep in touch. We'll see you soon.